celebrate Quiltfolk's brand new pattern called Be Mine, which is this lovely heart behind me, I'm going to give you a quick tutorial on sewing perfect half square triangle blocks. In terms of fabric choices, you could go for a very pretty rainbow effect like the one that is behind me. You could use a single colour for your heart or pop in lots of different fabrics that have a special meaning to you. Tools that you will be using include some pins, make sure that they are nice and sharp, a pencil, a ruler, a long ruler that will go right across the size of the block. So this is a 12 by 1 inch here. I've got some snips just for when I'm trimming my threads away. This ruler is also helpful for these size blocks. This is a 6.5 inch square ruler, and I really like to use this for trimming down at the end. Also, rotary cutter is very handy for that job. And then the fabrics which you have cut to 7 inches square. I'm going to take my cream background square and turn it over to the wrong side. And with my pencil and ruler, I'm going to mark a diagonal line from one corner to the other, only in one direction, and it doesn't matter which one you choose. So a nice sharp pencil is the top tip here, so you get a very clean line to work from, and you just want to take time to line it up as neatly as you can and draw that line in place. A pencil is fine. It will you're actually going to cut on this line later, so it isn't going into the finished quilt, and I just find it's the most reliable tool to use, that I've always got one handy as well. So once I've got that drawn line, then I can take my heart fabric, so a coloured fabric in this case, and I don't need to mark a line on this, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the cream square right sides of my fabric together and lay that on top. So you only need to mark up the diagonal line on one half of your fabrics that you're using. Don't need it on here. So line that up nice and neatly, and then just put a couple of pins. I put them quite close to my drawn line, but far enough away that my machine foot will be able to pass by without coming into contact with the pin, so they can stay in whilst I'm piecing. So a pin either side of the drawn line, and then it's ready to stitch. On the machine, we are going to stitch 1/4 inch either side of the drawn line to make our seam. The problem with using a traditional 1/4 inch foot, which has a guide on it like this one, is that this protrudes beneath the foot. So it's very good when you're using it on the edge of a fabric, like here, as a guide, but actually when you're working in the centre of a fabric, it's a little bit more problematic and can waver a little bit, and we want to be as accurate as possible. So what I do is I actually use my regular foot for my sewing machine, and I move my needle to a 1/4 inch position, which I'm going to show you how to do now on the sewing machine. Here is how to get the perfect 1/4 inch with your regular presser foot. So on my machine, when I switch it on, the zigzag setting, or the stitch width, is 3.5, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that up, and my needle, when I do that, will shift to the right. So I'm going to move it up to 5.5, and to check if that is my true 1/4 inch, you just get a tape measure. So I'm going to line up the 2 inch marking here with the edge of the presser foot, or you can go with any inch marking, like so. This is proper old school. I'm going to then turn my wheel and put the needle down in to the tape measure, bring it back up, release the presser foot, and I can see that I have got a hole from where my needle has gone into the tape measure nicely on that 1/4 inch setting. So I know I'm now perfectly set up to sew my 1/4 inch seams on my half square triangle units. As you can see, I have prepped my half square triangle units with the pencil lines and the pins, so do as many of those as you would like to, and then once you come to the machine you can actually chain piece them to save time and thread, and I will show you how to do that now. I'm going to take my pair of fabrics and I'm going to align the edge of the presser foot with the pencil line and ensuring that the needle is going to be right on the edge of the fabric there. So I'm going to put my needle down. I'm using a darkish grey thread here so that you can see it clearly. The thread that you use won't be seen, but obviously you could go for something that coordinates with the fabrics that you're using. A neutral grey is usually a good choice. And then I've got a stitch length of 2.2, which is the default on my machine and what I use for piecing patchwork. And I can begin to stitch, and my eye is focused on the edge of the presser foot and the line as opposed to my needle. So I'm creating a 1/4 inch seam which is to the side of the marking that I have made, and my hands are just keeping the fabric nice and flat as I move through the machine. When you get more confident you might want to speed up a little. So in order to chain piece, I can pause when I get to the end of that unit, and then I can simply bring in my next one, which I have also prepared, line up the pencil, which you can see there, with the edge of the presser foot and continue to stitch. So essentially I'm feeding in my next pair of fabrics without having to lift the presser foot and cut my threads, and it's a quicker way when you're piecing the same units over and over again, so you can get into a really nice rhythm. So at this point I'm going to bring in the next unit and I'm stitching to the left hand side of my pencil line, but when you've done all your units on the left hand side, when it comes to the last one like here, you can run off there. You can then cut your threads, and then you can simply bring the units back round, rotate them 180 degrees and start at the other side. So you can then line up again, put the edge of the presser foot down on the pencil line, pop the needle down and begin to start sewing 1/4 inch on the other side of your pencil line. So there is no stitching on the drawn line in a half square triangle units. That is our guide for sewing and for cutting at the next step. And when you're chain piecing, as you come up now towards the end here, you then simply get your next unit flat and pencil line to the edge of the presser foot, and the little chain of stitches that you're creating you snip off afterwards, so I guess that's why it's called chain piecing, and you're creating a long chain of blocks stitched together, and off we go again. So hopefully that all makes sense. Because I have chain pieced, I then have these little links of thread here. I don't go near those with a rotary cutter for fear of losing some edges off my blocks, so it's much easier just to go in with your snips at this point and cut each of those threads, and then you can trim down your block. So I would remove the pins before I come to this now with a rotary cutter, so they're not needed anymore. And then with your long ruler you position that on your pencil line, and with your rotary cutter you're now going to actually cut on the drawn line. So just starting a little bit off and moving right along like so. Okay, if for any reason it doesn't cut first time, do remember always with a rotary cutter to come back around and have another go cutting away from yourself. Don't have the temptation to cut back on yourself towards your body in case you lose control of the blade and hurt yourself. And there we have, once you open these up, you have a lovely half square triangle unit, and not just one, but two. So you can now press these and get them ready to go to trim and put into your quilt. For pressing, take each of your blocks and start on the wrong side. So in this scenario, I would press towards the dark side so that this isn't going to show through on the cream. If you've got a high contrasting fabric, then generally to press to the dark side when you can is the rule for quilters. So nice and gently on the wrong side. And what's really crucial is that you do also press it from the right side. So then turn it over and give a really nice press here, just making sure that there is no crease here and that it lays lovely and flat. A good thing to remember is that a well-pressed seam doesn't cast a shadow. So if for any reason you're getting a little shadow from the dark fabric on the light, then you probably need to go in and just have another go at that as well. All that's left to do now is to trim this block to the exact size so we get accurate piecing when the heart comes together, and obviously trim away the little dog ears, as we call them, on the ends here. Once this has been pressed, there isn't a huge amount to trim away, but for accuracy you definitely do then need to just square these up, and this is where this 6.5 inch ruler can come in really handy. Your key points here for reference are that the 45-degree line that runs across this ruler is matching at the corners and is exactly aligned there with the fabrics on both ends. And sometimes you can just tweak a little bit underneath the ruler to position it and jiggle it a little bit until you're happy that that is precise. If it goes slightly off in the center, that's not an issue. It's the end points here that are your key concern. And then holding the ruler nice and securely with your rotary cutter, you can move around and trim away the excess and those dog ears. So I'm just going to start here. If you've got a rotating cutting mat, which some people do have, that's very handy. And to go here along this top edge and clear that out of the way, and then I would just take that top corner down to the bottom left and reposition so that I'm cutting without moving my body around too much. You can see this edge is now clear, so I'm right at the bottom because that's already been trimmed, and I just have a tiny little bit. It looks marginal and you could be tempted to think you can get away without doing it, but it does honestly help greatly when you're sewing all these blocks together to get a really nice finish on the quilt. So once you've done that with all of your half square triangles, you're ready to start to piece the quilt together. So the top tips are: sharp pencil when you're making your line. Ensure that you've got a 1/4 inch seam on your machine. If anything, if it goes slightly under 1/4 inch, that's much better than going over. You haven't got room to go over 1/4 inch from that pencil line. And then pressing really, really well and taking the time to trim down your blocks to 6.5 inches. To bind the quilt, you're going to begin by cutting your strips 2.25 inches wide, which you can see here I have done, and you're going to cut enough strips that you know will go around the entire circumference of your quilt. So you can always use a binding calculator online, or if you've got a pattern, it will tell you the amount that you need to cut, the number of strips. And then to join them together, then you take the first strip with the right side up, so the wrong side of your fabric is down, and you bring your next strip, and to be consistent, I always bring mine in from the right hand side, from the same direction each time, and you're just going to overlap them a little bit here, What we're doing is we're marking this line to stitch on from this corner up to the top here. If you don't have this slight overlap, then what happens is if you were just to do it like that, then you see your starting point here, but you can't see clearly where your line is going to finish without looking underneath. So it's much easier and more accurate to just have that very slight overlap, and all that gets trimmed away later. And then with a marking tool of your choice, I've actually just got a pencil here, which I'll see nice and visibly on this fabric. On a darker fabric, you might want to use a chalk pencil, but you won't see this at all. It's on the wrong side of the fabric. Then you align here the bottom left and the top right, and you're going to make your drawn line here. You need a sharp pencil or marking tool because you need to be very accurate, or as accurate as you can be when you're stitching this. So don't use a wide piece of chalk because it'll already probably be a few millimeters thick, and that won't help you very much. So I'm just going to make this line, draw it on so it's nice and clear. I can see that now, and I'm going to put a pin either side of that line, far enough away that I can actually not have to remove it once I get to the machine. So I'll be able to glide my machine foot through that gap there without taking out the pins, and that is secure. And then I'm going to bring on my next piece of binding. So what you just have to remember to do is to open this out again so it's right side up, bring all this strip, however long it is, back into that starting position, and then off you go again, and you bring your next one in from the right and lay it down to mark that line. Where you are only likely to go wrong is if for any reason you actually mark this diagonal instead. To ensure it's correct, all you have to think is if you were to open this up on the stitch line, then you can see that the binding would continue. If you stitched the wrong way, you wouldn't have the ability to do that, and it would be coming back on itself. So again, mark your line, pin, open it up, and bring on the next strip until you have pinned all of your strips together. Another good thing when you're overlapping is that actually if you've got the selvage, which you sometimes do have because you often cut the binding out of the width of your fabric, then by having that little overlap there, you can ensure that these won't be seen on the final binding anyway, because you're going to stitch from here to here. You couldn't get away with stitching including the selvage, because actually when that's peeled back you might end up seeing a peep of the selvage on your finished quilt. You can see that I have machine stitched on that pencil line there with a small stitch length like you would use for piecing your quilt, so 2.2 or 2.4. And once you've done that, you can just remove the pins, and then with your rotary cutter or some scissors, you put a 1/4 inch line onto that stitch line like so, and then you just cut away the excess there. And you can also, with the rotary cutter or with some scissors, just cut away the little dog ear overhang there on that bottom right hand corner, and same, just level it off at the top there. And you do that for all of the joins you've made, and then you take it to your pressing station and you are going to press this seam here. I actually prefer on my binding to press the seam open so that it lays really nice and flat. And once you've done that for all of them, then you take your binding again, still over on the pressing station, and you're going to fold it in half with the wrong side of it together like so, and you're going to press it all the way along the full strip so that you've got enough binding to go around the whole of your quilt, and it's all ready to take to the machine with your quilt which has been trimmed down, and we can then put the binding on. So here is the binding all pressed. I know that there is enough to go around all of my quilt, And what you want to do initially is, it doesn't particularly matter where you start stitching it, but it's going on to the right side of your quilt. And I normally start about halfway down one of my sides, rather than the top or the bottom. So I'm going to just open it out, and you want to leave a good 10 inches or so to finish it off with the magic trick I will be showing you later. So I'm just going to pop a pin in here, and a quick check that is worth doing before you go to the machine. You don't have to pin all the binding in place, but what is good to do is do a quick whiz around your quilt. So I'll just move this along so that you can see, especially if you've made quite a scrappy binding. What you want to just check quickly is that when you come to a corner and you make a fold like this, that you haven't got a join in your binding on a corner, and just do that all the way around the quilt. And if for any reason you have got a join, then adjust the starting position here, because the problem is it's very hard to get a neat mitered corner if you've got a join stitched in there as well, and it just makes life easier. Stitch length when you are sewing on your binding, I do go up to 3.0 on my machine, because if you think about it, you've got your batting, you've got your quilt top, your quilt back, and 2 layers of fabric on your binding as well. So just to avoid a teeny tiny stitch that might ruche things up, it's better, it will lay flatter if you go up a little bit. So I go up to 3 to stitch. The binding is stitched on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I've got my HP foot here. You may have a 1/4 inch foot, or you may have shifted your needle position to know that that's the seam allowance you have. So I'm not starting, I've got this 10 inches or so of the binding which is loose. I'm going to start at that pin marker here, take that out, and all my raw edges are together. The raw edges of my binding against the raw edges of my quilt top. Going to put the presser foot down, needle down, and I am ready to start stitching with that 3.0 stitch length. You can do a quick back stitch where you're starting off, and then the key is just to keep everything nice and flat. It's important to have your quilt like well supported around you on a table, a chair, on your knee or something, just so it doesn't drag, because that will only make this seam allowance get skinnier. So just take as much time as you are stitching to actually make sure your quilt is really well supported around you, and it will make it much easier. And I always keep my hand just keeping everything nice and smooth as I stitch along. So I'm 1/4 inch. I don't want to go any skinnier than that, else there'll be nothing to see on the front of the quilt. As I'm coming towards a corner, what I need to have is a visual of what is 1/4 inch before the edge of the quilt. So if you've got a ruler or a 1/4 inch marker handy, line up a 1/4 inch on the edge of the quilt, and with the pin that you've taken out earlier, you can just give yourself a marker there. Or you can draw on that with a little chalk pencil if you like, but then you're stitching up until that point with your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and when you get to that point, then you can do a reverse stitch, so you're finishing off essentially. Come back on yourself, cut your threads, and what's important to remember is that you finish off, remove the quilt and turn it around 90 degrees before you actually make the mitered corner. I've rotated the quilt 90 degrees, and the first thing to do is to then put the binding away from yourself to the back there. Just take that thread away, and then you're going to fold it back on itself. So essentially what you're doing is you're creating like a raised triangle here, which sits towards the left, and this edge here is flush again with the edge of the quilt top, so that this is going to create your corner. Okay, so you finish stitching 1/4 inch underneath there, you fold away from yourself to the corner and back on yourself and line up this edge. And then what you want to do is go back in underneath the presser foot. Again, back with your 1/4 inch seam allowance. I like to put the needle down to secure that corner, press a foot down, and away we go again with our stitching. And once I've stitched a little bit further, I'll be able to show you how that has made a nice mitered corner. So off we go again. At this point you have to push off because you've got a lot of layers of fabric underneath there. You can back stitch or not, it's not that essential at that point. And off we go again, keeping everything nice and flat until we get to our next corner. So here is the nice corner. You can see that when you come to turn it over onto the back, then you've automatically got that neat miter there. What you'll find is that if you don't measure this 1/4 inch before the edge, and don't stop stitching there, if you're a bit shy of that and stop earlier, that when you actually go to fold over the corner, your binding will be unsecured here. It's not the end of the world. You could go in and stitch it by hand, but it's obviously easier if you come right up to that point so that you can make your miter, fold it at the back and stitch it down, as I'll show you later on. I've stitched around all 4 of my corners, and on this last side of the quilt, so where I started stitching the binding, I have finished off stitching a good 12-14 inches before where I started. So you've got this nice open gap here, and what I'm going to do is show you now a trick for finishing off your binding really neatly. So you need to have a couple of pins, a pencil and some scissors handy, and we'll zoom in and show you the details. First thing to do is to take a little bit off the excess binding here. So just cut yourself a piece and open it up like so. So we know actually, because we cut this earlier, this is 2 1/4 inches wide. But what you can do is you can just lay this next to where you have got this binding on the right hand side here. Okay, and just make a little mark there. So just stretch that out and then pop a little pin in there. And you then bring in the binding here, which is still loose, and you're going to overlap it here up until that point there. Okay, so it's overlapping 2 1/4 inches from the edge of the binding beneath it, and at that point there you're then going to cut it away. Okay, so you know you've now got the correct length of binding to finish off your quilt. And the reason that you have left these unsecured to this point is so that you can now take them away, and you've got plenty of room off the quilt to make a 45-degree angle join, just like you did when you made the binding in the first place. So take the binding on the right hand side and open it up with the right side facing upwards, and then take the binding from the left hand side, place it over the top, right sides together, and you're going to put them so that they are matching up at that top corner there, and that they are flush at the sides as well. And what we want to do is we want to now draw a stitch line from this corner on the left over to this corner on the right, so that when they are stitched you can see it will open up and be a continuous piece of binding. So you don't have the overlap, you don't have these overlapped like when we made the binding in the first place. They have to be flush because this is exactly the right length to then fit around the entire quilt. So sometimes it just takes a little bit of patience just to line them up properly. Then you need to have your pencil, your marking tool and your ruler at hand so that you can lay that nice and flat. You can double check underneath that those points are in the right place there and there. Draw your line, which will become your stitch line in a moment, And what's really important to do as well is just to pop a couple of pins in, because this can easily spring out of place and go a little bit wonky at this point. So again, I'm going to pin either side of my pencil line far enough away that my machine foot will just glide through. And I'm going to go to the machine and put your stitch length back down if you've had it up to put the binding on. So go back to your normal piecing stitch length and just secure the two pieces of binding together. Once that line has been stitched, you can remove the pins, and with a rotary cutter or just with the scissors, you're then cutting away this extra here, this seam allowance, down to 1/4 inch or so, just like you did when you were making the binding before. It might be easier with the scissors just because it doesn't lay very flat to rotary cut at this point. And then I'm going to press that seam open and going to press it back in half again. And what you can see is that you now have a finished binding that's joined here, which exactly fits the remainder of the quilt there, which is unsecured. Once you've pressed it, you can then simply go back in where you finished off stitching here on the left, do a little back stitch on your machine, still your 1/4 inch seam allowance, and go along until you meet where you first began stitching your binding together. So it's a very neat way to finish your binding at exactly the right length. To hand stitch your binding down, I've got a nice needle that I'm comfortable working with. This is a between, whichever size you're happy with. You don't have to go crazy with the length of thread, really. Wrist to elbow, a little bit longer if you like, and you can condition the thread so it doesn't knot if you've got any thread conditioner or wax. I like to have a little wonder clip like this that just I move along as I go, but it's not necessary if you haven't got one. And what you need to do, you can start wherever you want to do, is just bring that binding over from the right side of your quilt. So you don't need to press here. It's just making sure you've got a nice fold, and it will be just the right width of binding that it will cover the stitches that you've made here, and it will feel nice and secure so that you've got a nice firmness to it there. And I'm just going to pop a little clip in here, just a little bit to the left, so that I can work where I go. I've got a knot on my thread, so initially I just tend to come up only in the seam allowance here, so I'm away from the right side of the quilt, and just secure my knot in there, and then bring the binding over, and you can start to stitch. And what's important really to remember is that you want your stitch to travel along through the wadding or the batting and the quilt back, and come up on the very edge of the binding like so, okay, and make that stitch there. What's important is that it doesn't travel through onto the front of your quilt so that you don't see it visible. And often I always just flick over now and again just to check I haven't got any stitches that have come through. And then I'm going back down parallel to where my thread is, and I'm going back down, and I'm traveling a small distance again inside the quilt sandwich but not on the quilt top, and coming up a little bit further along like so, and you get into a nice rhythm. So basically the way I think of it is that a lot of your thread is sitting within the quilt itself, and that means it's nice and secure in there, and just a smaller stitch is sitting within the binding. If you were to travel and do most of your stitch in the binding and only tiny one in the quilt, then that's all that you've got securing that to the quilt sandwich. So it's better to have a bigger stitch traveling into the quilt and a tiny bit on the edge of the binding like so. And as you can see, my thread coordinates with my binding fabric, because that will be the only time where you will see it. You don't see what's going into the quilt sandwich, you're just seeing this very tiny stitch right on the edge of the binding there. So match your thread colour to the binding. When you get to a corner, I can show you how I deal with those now. To stitch down a corner, then as you come up to it, I've stopped securing the binding just an inch or so away, and you then mitre, fold your corner. So if you just have a little play around, holding this flat, and then I'm going to fold it over from the corner so that that meets and looks neat. I can just check on the other side that I'm happy as well. You can tweak it if you need to, but just fold that over, and then I tend to just secure it with my clip right on the edge there so that doesn't shift. And I'm going to continue stitching into that corner there and around to the left. I don't go up into the actual fold. Some people do. It's not necessary because the binding will be nicely secured here, and then carry on before I make my next corner. And you stitch all of this down, and then all you have to do is label your quilt. Don't forget to do that. But you've got a lovely neat binding to finish off your quilt.